I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but life has a strange way of unraveling, doesn't it? My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how I caught my mother in the act and how everything spiraled out of control after that. It all began on a warm Sunday afternoon. My parents had been married for almost 30 years, and while they weren't the most romantic couple, I always believed they were happy. My father was a quiet man, more focused on his work than his emotions, and my mother, well, she was the kind of woman who thrived on attention, but never did I imagine that her need for attention would lead to something like this. John had been around our family for as long as I could remember. He was my father's best friend, a charming, charismatic man who seemed to have it all together. He was always there for my dad, always the guy to give advice, help fix things, or be a shoulder to lean on. I had grown up seeing him as a part of the family, but things started to change when I noticed how often John came over, even when my father wasn't around. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was like an uncle to me, and I assumed he was just helping my mum with errands or offering support while Dad was away on business. But there was something in the air that didn't sit right with me. The way they laughed at each other's jokes a little too hard, the way my mother's eyes lit up when John walked into the room. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. After all, it was John, my father's best friend. There was no way anything inappropriate could be happening, right? One afternoon, everything changed. I had come home from work earlier than expected. I remember feeling uneasy as I walked through the front door, a strange tension in the air. My mum hadn't mentioned that John was coming over that day, but as soon as I heard voices coming from the kitchen, my stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. As I crept down the hallway, their hushed whispers grew louder. My heart was pounding, and I was torn between turning around and leaving or facing what I feared. The moment I turned the corner and saw them standing far too close, my mother's hand gently caressing John's arm, I froze. It wasn't an intimate act, but it was enough. Enough to make my blood boil, enough to confirm the worst thoughts that had been swirling in my head for weeks. They hadn't seen me yet. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching their conversation grow more intense. John leaned closer, his hand resting on the small of my mother's back. Her face was flushed, her breathing rapid, and for a split second I thought they might— No, I couldn't watch any longer. "Mum!" My voice cracked, and they both jumped back as if burned. The guilt on my mother's face was undeniable. She stammered something incoherent and backed away from John as if that would erase what had just happened. John looked horrified too, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of defiance perhaps, as if he wasn't sorry at all. "Rachel, it's not what it looks like," my mum blurted out, her voice shaking. But I wasn't buying it. "Please, just let me explain." I wanted to shout. I wanted to shout at her, at John, at the whole situation, but I couldn't. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, a million thoughts running through my head. How long had this been going on? What would my dad think? And most importantly, how could she betray him like this? "Explain what, Mum?" I finally managed to say, my voice icy. "What exactly is there to explain?" John started to speak, but I cut him off with a glare. I couldn't even look at him without feeling sick. This man, who had been like family to me, had crossed a line that could never be crossed again. And my mother, my own mother, had let it happen. "It shouldn't have happened," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "It's just, your father and we've been distant for so long. I never meant for it to come to this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was she really trying to justify this? Did she think her loneliness excused what she had done? I felt my world shattering around me, the solid foundation of trust I had always had in my family crumbling to dust. And John, I spat his name like it was poison. What about him? What does he have to say for himself? John, to his credit, didn't try to make excuses. He simply stood there, looking guilty and ashamed, but somehow still arrogant. It made me hate him even more. "I made a mistake, Rachel," he said quietly. "A huge mistake. I care about your family and I never meant to hurt anyone." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. A mistake? This wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, and no amount of apologies could fix it. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, leaving them both standing there in stunned silence. I couldn't deal with it. I needed time to think, to process what I had just witnessed. How could my mother do this to my father? How could John, someone I had trusted all my life, have been a part of this? I spent the next few hours driving around aimlessly, trying to make sense of the situation. I knew I couldn't keep this a secret from my father, but at the same time, I wasn't prepared to destroy our family. I didn't want to be the one to tear it all apart, but how could I look my father in the eye, knowing what I knew? My phone buzzed on the seat next to me, and I glanced down to see a text from my mum. "Please come home, we need to talk." I wasn't ready to talk, not yet, but I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, I would have to face them both and decide what to do next. But as I pulled over to the side of the road and stared blankly out of the window, one thing became painfully clear. Things would never be the same. I stayed in the car for hours, the weight of what I had just discovered pressing down on me like a heavy cloud. My head was spinning, but I knew I couldn't stay out forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to go home and face my mother and John. I thought about what to do next. Telling my dad seemed like the right thing to do, but I wasn't sure how to break the news without destroying him. My parents had built a life together, years of shared memories, struggles, and love. I knew that what I had seen could destroy all that. As the sun went down, I finally got up the courage to go home. When I walked through the door, my mother was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me with a mixture of guilt and fear, but I had no sympathy to offer her. Not yet. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice small and shaky. "Yes, we do," I replied coldly, my emotions still a mess. I sat down across from her, keeping my distance. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was suffocating, but I didn't want to break it first. Finally, she took a deep breath and began. "I never wanted you to find out like this, Rachel. I never wanted you to find out at all." "That's comforting," I said sarcastically. "So you were just going to keep sneaking around behind Dad's back? How long has that been going on?" She winced at the harshness of my words, but didn't try to defend herself. "It's complicated. It started a few months ago. I never meant for it to become anything serious. I was just lonely and John was there." "Lonely?" I repeated, disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. "That's your excuse? You were lonely, so you turned to Dad's best friend. Do you have any idea what that will do to him?" Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. "I know I've hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt your father too. I don't know how to make it right." I stood up, unable to sit still. "You can't fix it, Mum. You've broken something that can't be fixed." She sobbed softly into her hands, but I didn't move to comfort her. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. Just as I was about to leave the room, the front door swung open and my father walked in. He smiled when he saw us, oblivious to the storm brewing in our living room. "Hey, girls," he said cheerfully. "What's going on?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment when everything came crashing down. My mother and I exchanged glances, both of us knowing there was no easy way out. "I need to talk to you," I blurted out, my voice shaking, "about something important." He looked worried and put down his briefcase, sensing the tension in the room. "What is it? Is everything all right?" I hesitated. How could I tell him? How could I break the trust he had in the two people he loved most? But before I could say anything, my mother stood up and wiped away her tears. "I have something to tell you," she said quietly as she stepped forward. My father's eyes darted between us, confused. "Carol, what's going on?" he asked, his tone suspicious. I made a terrible mistake," she whispered, "something I never thought I'd do." My father frowned, but still didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" She looked at him, her eyes full of regret and pain. "It's John. He and I, we crossed a line." There was a deafening silence in the room. My father's face grew pale as her words slowly sank in. For a moment it seemed he hadn't heard her correctly, but then the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, but there was an edge of disbelief that quickly turned to anger. "I'm so sorry," my mother choked out, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" My father's voice rose, raw anger flashing in his eyes. "You betrayed me with my best friend and you call it a mistake?" I could feel the tension in the air, my father's devastation palpable. I had never seen him like this, so broken, so hurt. The man who had always been my rock looked as if his whole world had collapsed around him. "How long?" he demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. "How long has this been going on?" My mother sobbed uncontrollably, unable to speak. I couldn't stand to watch any longer, so I stepped in. "Dad, I found out today," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "It's been going on for a couple of months." He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. I could see the pain in his eyes, but there was something else: betrayal, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. The woman he had loved for decades had betrayed him, and so had the man he had called his best friend. "I can't believe it," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. "I never thought... Carol, how could you..." "I'm sorry," she cried. "I never meant to hurt you. I just felt so alone." "And you think that makes it okay?" he shouted, his voice full of bitterness. "You think that justifies this?" "I know it doesn't," she whispered, her tears falling faster. "I've ruined everything." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was unbearable, the weight of what had just been revealed hanging over us like a dark cloud. My father stared at my mother, the woman he had trusted with his heart, and I could see the devastation written all over his face. "I've got to get out of here," he finally said, his voice hoarse. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. My mother collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, numb, unsure of what to do next. Everything I had known about my family, about the people I loved, had been torn apart in a matter of hours. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," my mum whispered through her tears. "I never wanted this to happen." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to comfort her, or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. As I sat down on the couch, staring at the door my father had just stormed through, I wondered how we would ever move forward from this.